Hi, and welcome to Digital Defense. I am your host, Jordan Robertson, broadcasting to you live from the Washington, D.C. Bureau of Bloomberg News. This is our weekly cybersecurity and digital privacy show. This is your show. We want this to be interactive. So wherever you're watching this, whether it's on Facebook or the Bloomberg Terminal or any other platform, please feel free to type in any questions you have into the comment section, and we'll address as many of those as we can today. So the topic of today's discussion is a breach at British Airways. Some of you may have seen the news this week. It wasn't a massive breach by kind of today's standards. It was several 100,000 people's credit card information, people who are booking flights with British Airways. I believe we have a photo here. Let's pull this up. So, by today's standards, where we see, Yahoo, I think, set the standard with 3 billion accounts compromised, this attack on British Airways doesn't measure up in that sense, but it's really important for a couple other reasons. And I want to give you some context around the attack. And also, what do those of us who use a credit card to purchase, airplane tickets, are there ways to protect your financial information while you're traveling? But first for some context. So the British Airways hack affected about 400,000 people. The hackers were capturing people's financial information as they were entering it into the website. So as far as we can tell, this was a kind of a straight-ahead website attack. Websites have lots and lots of bugs and vulnerabilities, and you don't have to compromise the deep guts of an airline's IT systems to actually make off with a lot of their customers' financial information. Based on some third-party research that's been published, it looks like the attackers were able to accomplish this hack by compromising the British Airways website. So 400,000 people, payment information, so names, credit card information, also crucially the validation code, the 3 or 4 digit validation code on those credit cards that gives the hackers, kind of the immediate use, the availability to use those credit card numbers immediately for fraudulent transactions. Why is this breach important? Well, it's important for a couple of reasons. One, this is one of the first breaches we're seeing being disclosed after Europe's new data privacy regulation has come into play. There's been a lot of discussion around those new privacy laws in Europe, the main point here is they mandate a very, very tight turnaround in terms of when a company discovers a breach and when they notify the public. Now, for the last year or so, companies of all kinds have been working really hard to get their heads around the new regulations. Most of the discussion we've seen has been around the collection of data from websites. So as almost all of us have seen, if you've gone to a website in the last 6 months, which all of us have, if you go there, chances are you've seen a new privacy notice that you have to click on. Most of us just click it and keep moving. But the reason websites in the US and abroad are doing those new notifications are as a result of new European data privacy standards. So that's where the conversation is mostly focused, on privacy. Well, the privacy laws also have a new strict requirement regarding breach disclosure. And British Airways disclosed the breach, again, 400,000 people, a little bit less than that. The number may grow, the number may fall. These things tend to be pretty fluid. They disclosed it. The new rule mandates that disclosure has to happen within 72 hours of discovering a breach. Now, that sounds reasonable. That is lightning fast, though, for a data breach investigation. Companies have tended to err on the side of waiting too long to disclose things because these investigations take time. You'll discover something is wrong on your network, you'll look a little bit, you'll discover some data might have been taken, you'll call in an outside contractor to come in and investigate. That might take them days or even weeks. You have to analyze that report. You've got to kick the hackers out. This can take months to remediate a breach. So the significance of this breach, again, is not so much in the numbers, but what it represents. This major airline disclosed a breach of several 100,000 customers' payment information, literally within hours of discovering it. So that's huge. Is it good? Is it bad for the industry? Who knows? But here's what happened. It gave the banks time. What the banks did was the banks just proactively canceled cards and issued new ones. They said, we're not going to wait to be contacted by the airline. We're not going to wait to be contacted by customers who've seen fraudulent transactions on their accounts. We're just going to cancel them all and renew them. And so that's really interesting. That's new because, the status quo has been, just once again, that companies wait a long time to disclose these things. In most states in the U.S., there's typically a 90-day window in which companies must disclose breaches involving personally identifiable information. So, we've got 90 days in the U.S. versus 3 overseas. It's incredible. I mean, it's really interesting to watch. And as a cybersecurity reporter who's been covering the space for over a decade, this is a pretty fascinating development, because what happens is the public gets, information very quickly. That gives us, tools and the ability to hopefully better protect our data. But also what's going to happen is you're going to see this information change. Just based on what I know about these breach investigations, they're very fluid. So what you might think of now is 400,000 people's credit card information. That number could change. It could go up wildly. It could go down. It could stay the same. These investigations are very fluid, so I would expect more updates from it. But the biggest news here is that as a result of these new European privacy laws, which so many companies have complained about, they have discussed, complained about the cost, they've complained about the complexity, and all of those things are true. But in this particular case, we talk about data breaches, we talk about disclosures. I view this as a big win for consumers because you have information. British Airways was forced to disclose the exact timetable, the exact window in which customers' data was stolen. So if you didn't book a ticket between that window, chances are you can think you're probably in the clear, at least for this hack, maybe not others. But if they did affect you, you have really actionable information to go monitor your accounts. And not just wait for something bad to happen, but you can monitor your accounts, you can request a new card. That's actionable information that basically in almost all data breaches, consumers don't get until it's too late. Even a 90-day window, which is very company-friendly. That's a company-friendly kind of rule. And they were considered very innovative for their time. 60 to 90 days, states had to pass those regulations here in the U.S., kind of against many companies' wishes. So that's what we're seeing. What we're seeing with this British Airways hack is really the new standard for reporting data breaches. And I think overall it's fascinating to watch. And it's also, I think, ultimately good for consumers because you get information that you can really act on. And again, if you're just joining us, this is this is our weekly cybersecurity and privacy show called Digital Defense. We're discussing the hack announced this week by British Airways of some 400,000 users, credit card information, and we're talking about ways that you can protect your information when you travel, and also what do these new European data privacy and security laws mean for you. The one big takeaway from today's shows, before I get to some questions, is that because of these new laws, as onerous as certain companies, many companies have said and complained that these new laws are, for consumers, this is a great example of that's a pretty big win. It's a pretty big win. And I think it's kind of great and really interesting to see. And with that, we're going to try to get to some questions here. Let's see here. So again, if you're just joining us, please feel free to send in any questions you have. Type them into the comments section, whether you're watching this on the Bloomberg terminal, Facebook, any other platform. We like this show to be interactive, so please shoot any questions my way about cybersecurity, privacy, any other topics. Let's see here. Let's get to the first question. British Airways said that passport information was not affected. How can they be sure of that? Okay, well, you've teed up one of my next slides quite perfectly. This slide is just, was the public announcement. Again, days after discovering it, which is pretty amazing. What I want to show you is just a screen of code. Don't worry about what the code actually says. You probably can't see all the characters. But the point of this slide is to say the attackers, this is showing some of the steps that the attackers took to modify essentially just a few lines of code on the British Airways main website and mobile app, the servers that populate the mobile app. A few changes to a few lines of code were all the attackers needed to do to take information that somebody's entering into the website legitimately and redirect it. They send it to the website and they also redirect it to their own servers. It's not that savvy an attack. And again, the point of all this, you don't have to worry about what these words mean. But there are lines in the code that tell the computer where to send information. And by manipulating some of those pieces of data, the attackers were able to essentially make a copy of this information and send it to themselves. Not super sophisticated, but because there were flaws in the way the website processed information, the hackers were able to do that. So I'll scroll you off this screen for a minute. But the significance of that is the reason that that's important is based on some public research. It appears that the part of the British Airways site that was vulnerable was something in like the baggage claim check. Like you can enter your number and you can track your baggage or something if it's lost. So in response to this question, the way British Airways presumably knows what information was taken and what wasn't is the hackers left a breadcrumb trail. They left clues in their code when the code was changed, what it was doing, what it was seeking, what it was stealing, and what information the hackers had access to. So I should note, one of the downsides of these new European privacy laws is, British Airways has notified the public of this breach. People have actionable information. We've discussed that earlier. You can take proactive steps to protect your account if you're among, the 350 or 400,000 victims of this attack. Here's the downside of it. 3 days is not a lot of time for a company to get their arms around a breach. So what that means is this may be an element of a bigger hack. It may be the whole hack, or it may be an element of a bigger hack. We just don't know that, and British Airways may not have to disclose it. They may just not know yet either. So what British Airways has disclosed, to answer this viewer's question, which is a good one, is how do they know that it was only this credit card information? Well, the hackers essentially told them. The hackers, once they found the code, the malicious code in the website, British Airways was able to say, this is how the attack was done, this is what they were stealing. But was that it? Was that the only element of this attack? Did the hackers use their access to the British Airways website to get further into their network? Maybe, we don't know. But in terms of what they know for certain, which is the lawyers always make these decisions, this is kind of a sidebar, but what a lot of people don't realize is that when companies disclose breaches, it's typically the lawyers, it's the general counsel, that kind of oversee the investigation, they oversee the disclosure of this information. And what those general counsels will always say is, what do we know for a fact was taken? Not which systems were accessed, key distinction. What do we know for a fact was taken? And it's only the latter, it's only what they know for a fact was taken that they disclose. You don't want to disclose speculative information. Maybe passport information was taken. Maybe this other kind of information was taken. There's no legal advantage for you in that. So they only disclose what they know for a fact was taken, and that that disclosure this week kind of represents that. Next question: is British Airways responding the way they are because they don't want their stock to crash? No, I think they're responding. If I understand the question correctly, why are they acting so quickly in disclosing this? And the answer is they have to. I mean, this is the new law of the land, in Europe and by extension in many other places as well, because you want to follow the law. Kind of follows companies around wherever they do business in some cases. So British Airways is being very proactive about this because they have to. And this is kind of another, I think, misunderstood thing about cyber breaches and data disclosures. It's a real pet issue of mine because as a reporter, I run into this all the time. Whenever we're doing investigative projects or we're reporting on breaches that have not been public or even breaches that have been public. And the more we dig in and the more we talk to people involved in those incidents, whether on the corporate side or government side or whatever, what you very often discover, companies don't disclose these things voluntarily. Almost never does that happen. Every single company's default, with very few exceptions, most companies' default position is going to be, don't disclose unless you have to. Because, if it's customer information, perhaps you notify the bank issues a new card. Do you want to put out a press release? No company wants to put out a press release about a breach ever, under any circumstance. But in many cases, they have to. Here in the States, we have these laws, these state, personal identifiable information breach notification laws. So if a company loses your name and your social security number and your date of birth or whatever, your street address, your phone number, then they have to disclose it to you. But companies don't want to disclose any of these things. They are not being proactive just for the sake of being proactive. They're disclosing because they have to. That's certainly the case here. But companies can position this stuff differently. I think being proactive is a really positive thing. Being, kind of open and transparent about what you've discovered, it shortens the life cycle of the news story. So what a company is concerned about, to this viewer's question, is, impact on the stock price. Being transparent, being forthright about what happened and I talk to companies about this all the time. I'm like, what you don't want is to be so secretive that reporters and shareholders and investors get really interested in what happened because they think there's a secret there. And we saw this with the Equifax breach. Many of you might remember the Equifax breach from not too long ago. That was a really bad breach on its own. But what Equifax did, they were very proactive at first. They were very proactive at first and said, disclosing information, millions of credit profiles on people were taken. And so Equifax disclosed that information and kind of got a lot of kudos for being very quick and being very transparent about what they found. Here's the problem. Once people started poking, people like myself and others started poking the company for more information and started probing them, the company just shut down. Well, that makes people really interested. So myself and others began looking really hard at, what were the root causes of that breach? Who was involved? Is there more to the story? Shareholders as well. And regulators. So what regulators found when they started poking was this company wasn't transparent at all. They had, some of their insiders, some of their executives, at least one of their executives was accused of insider trading based on the information. It was just a mess. So it's a sword that can cut, kind of both ways. Being transparent can be a good thing, but you've got to be consistent about it. So if people take a real interest in this breach, and again, this breach kind of is more of a symbol, for the purposes of this discussion and for this show, of the impact of these new European privacy laws and breach disclosure laws. It's a total sidebar, but that's why companies disclose things. They don't disclose things because they want to. They disclose because they have to. Next question here. With hacks like the DNC, for example, it took months before anyone knew they were being hacked. How did British Airways know it had been hacked so fast? Well, we don't know the answer to that yet. At least I haven't seen the answer to that. Chances are, they were alerted to some sort of fraud. I'm just speculating here. Whenever credit information, there's a key distinction to be drawn here. So the viewer brings up the DNC hack. That was the hack, in 2015 and 2016 of the Democratic National Committee, the Democrat Party organization here in the United States. And, it took a long time, it took forever for the DNC to understand what was happening in its network, to even be aware of a breach. And that's because the attackers in that case, which the US government has attributed to Russia, Russian military officers, they were trying to be very covert. They were trying to steal lots and lots of really sensitive data over a long period of time. Those hackers wanted to be in there for the long haul. These hackers, by contrast, when you're talking about money and financial transactions, these hackers were after credit card numbers. They would like to be in there for a long time as well, but they also understand the moment you pop a server like this, the moment you steal a credit card number, especially in this case, credit card numbers with the CVV, with the validation code, the 3 or 4 digit validation code on the front or the back of the card, the thing that you need, essentially your PIN code to use that card online, the moment they get their hands on that hot piece of information, they're not going to sit on it too long. That information has a very short shelf life once they steal it. So I'm just guessing here, but based on my experience, again, I've been covering this space for over a decade, my experience is one of two things. One, they were either told about the breach by government. Government discovers these things a lot because they're monitoring hackers' networks, they're hacking the hackers, they see a lot of things. That's one way companies learn. But also they learn because they've seen fraud. So if somebody is using that information, that hacked data, for nefarious purposes, for fraudulent purposes, the banks will become aware of that. People report the fraud. The banks become aware of it. They trace the hack essentially that way, and they notify what they believe is the victim organization, and they start looking. So it tends to be different. The window between when a company learns about an attack, and when it discloses it, just tends to be very different for different types of attacks. In this case, financially motivated, apparently. And that information has a very short shelf life versus kind of more classic espionage operations, which the DNC hack, appeared very strongly to have been. Those are just long. Those are long operations. They're not meant to monetize the information. They're meant to just spy for as long as possible and to be as covert and under the covers for as long as possible. So in that sense, the attackers just make less noise. That's the short answer, the short way to say it. And in BA's case, they might not have. They might have used that data instantly and gotten caught. So that's one possibility. What does it say about British Airways security that hackers were able to execute such a simple attack? Going back to what the viewer is referring to, for those of you just joining us, this is just kind of an example of some of the code. that gives you kind of a visible example of what the hackers were able to do. This was not, unlike Equifax. Equifax was, just to use the example we just referenced, that was kind of more classic hack where hackers got deep into the guts of that organization's, computer network and extracted really sensitive data. What happened here with British Airways was the hackers simply modified the website. I mean, it sounds crazy that they were able to do this, but this is the way it worked, as far as we can understand. They modified the website to take a copy of people's financial information and send it to their own servers. I mean, that's it. The reason they were able to do that is, we believe, through a technique called cross-site scripting. You don't need to worry about all the technicals of how that works, but basically, the website for the code for any web page looks exactly like this. It's telling, it's giving the computer instructions about how to process certain keystrokes and commands and where to send data and how to process it and things like that. And in kind of simplified form, what the hackers did was they were able to add their own instructions, add their own code to say, for example, instead of sending it to the correct British Airways website, the data, send it there and also send it to me. Send it to a malicious address, and that's under the attacker's control. So what, in response to this question, what does it say about the security of their website? I gotta say, I've been covering cybersecurity a long time. This is the low-hanging fruit. So British Airways, they might have great security on the back end. They might have hired all the best companies to secure their corporate IT network. What they really need to be doing was to hire companies that can look for vulnerabilities like this on the website, because this is not Mission Impossible here. I mean, this is not, kind of the height of hacking capabilities. However, guess what? It was effective. So if you're one of these hackers and you've just stolen 400,000 people's credit card information, current credit card information with the 3 or 4 digit validation codes, and you have their name, and guess what? You have their address, you have all of their other personal information that you've got to add to access a travel website. I mean, you're booking a ticket. So you're entering lots of information. That information is super valuable. It's current. That's the thing. Cyber criminals, for all you read, this is another sidebar, but hopefully for those of you who like this show, this is part of the, this is some of my experience. I'm drawing in my experience as a reporter to offer you this perspective. What happens a lot of times is, you'll read about these breaches, and what you'll tend to read about is things like the dark web. The dark web has millions and millions and millions and millions of stolen records. You'll hear people say all the time, well, your information's for sale on the dark web anyway. Well, yes and no. There's a lot that's for sale on the dark web. There's a lot of personal data that's out there that shouldn't be. But here's the catch with that. A lot of it's old. Like your name and your social security number, obviously that doesn't change typically. But in terms of credit card information, bank account information, a lot of that data that's on the dark web is old. It's garbage data. It's either make-believe, it's made up, or it's old. It's some credit card account that you had 6 years ago that you no longer use. So it's really just it's very dicey. It's a very dicey space, the underground, economy. What this attack shows, though, is that when you get your hands, if you're a hacker and you get your hands on current information, you get your hands on current credit card information. You know it's current because the person just entered it into the website, and you've got their name, and you've got their validation codes. You can use that information instantly. That is so much more valuable than really anything you can buy on the dark web, which you don't even know the provenance of. You don't know if it's real. You've got to test it out, and that information often doesn't have those validation codes either. So that was a big get, by these guys. So what does it say about British Airways security? I think they probably could have caught this with a pretty routine website scan. Again, this is not Mission Impossible stuff here. We don't know all the specifics about how the attack happened, but based on what's public so far, I know countless companies that could have done that scan for them and probably found this hacking vulnerability. So, the good news is probably they're gonna get any money they want from the board, unlocked to make sure that those websites are secure going forward. So that's kind of a silver lining of a lot of these hacks. The next question here, is this hack similar to the Equifax hack? No, it's not really. The reason I brought up Equifax earlier was just to describe, and in fact, the differences between these attacks. The Equifax hack involved a server that should have been patched, or fixed, but wasn't, and had a known vulnerability. Attackers were able to scan the internet, looking for servers that are connected to the internet with that vulnerability. They're able to pop that server and get inside the Equifax network. As we've reported, there was some suspicion potentially they might have had insider involvement. It hasn't been fleshed out yet. So that's what the Equifax attack looked like. Well, the Equifax attack was kind of the standard database attack. The hackers got deep into the guts of the Equifax network and were able to extract from it millions and millions of previously stored records. What happened in the British Airways case was the hackers were able to monitor in real time people, inputting their credit card information and names and address onto the British Airways website or the mobile app. So it's a totally different type of attack. And this attack appears to be financially motivated. So it's a good reminder that, I'll say on this show a lot, well, don't worry too much about financial fraud involving credit cards and things like that, because your banks will reimburse you if you're dealing with reputable banking institutions. They'll reimburse you. They're really good at catching the fraud these days, so don't worry too much about it. But these new European data privacy laws, which require companies to disclose these breaches so quickly, in kind of this new world that we're entering with those laws, it actually might benefit you if you are a victim or potential victim of these attacks to actually look at your bank account and to make sure that there are no fraudulent transactions. That's one of the upsides of this new legislation in Europe. One of the downsides, of course, is you might have a lot of people doing due diligence checks that don't need to. But as a result of this and kind of other hacks, I might modify that advice a little bit and say, if you believe that you might be a victim, or if you've been notified that you're a victim, that's really actionable information. Go check your bank account. If there's no fraudulent activity, make sure your PIN code, you've got a strong PIN code on your account so nobody can call and pretend to be you. And also make sure if it hasn't been done already, you contact the bank and have them issue you a new card. Next question here. We're getting good questions. Thank you so much for these. We're almost out of time, but until then, if you have questions, please feel free to type them in. We'll get through as many of these as we can. Generally, if hackers gain access into a website and edit the contents, is it likely they gain deeper access to the servers? So this viewer brings up a very relevant question, which is, and we touched on this a little bit earlier in the show. What British Airways has disclosed is, hey, we know for a fact hackers stole information on these hundreds of thousands of British Airways customers. Here's what we know they stole. Here's when we know they stole it, and that's kind of the end of it. But what this viewer says is actually very accurate, which is, okay, so that we know that the hackers got access to that financial information. What's to have prevented them from going deeper into the British Airways system? And the answer is nothing. Once you get access to these systems, once you're able to modify code on a website, you're interacting with that institution, that organization's IT systems. You're not necessarily inside the server, you're kind of in the web application, but there's nothing preventing you from using that access as called a pivot point or a staging area and hunting for more vulnerabilities either in that application, in the underlying software, the underlying hardware. There are, depending on how these applications are secured, and this is a big business now, trying to secure these applications, it's an access point. It's the equivalent of, discovering that, there's a window ajar in a house. Like, maybe you can't reach the window, or maybe you have to reach it with a ladder, but it's a pretty good clue that maybe you can get inside that house. It's just going to take some more work. Kind of a tortured analogy, but the security industry is rife with tortured analogies, so bear with me on that. So in response to your question, we just don't know. We don't know if the hackers went further, but certainly that's something that British Airways is going to be looking at because it's unlikely that hackers with this level of skill, again, it may not be kind of the A+ state-sponsored hackers, but they may have been very skilled attackers, and they just didn't need to do more. What they're looking for is credit card information, and they got it. So in that sense, that was a successful hack. The next question here, and then we're almost out of time, is can you bring down a plane with a cyber attack? Okay, let's take it all the way out on this one. It's a very reasonable question. So when you hear an airline has been hacked, really important to distinguish between, were their IT systems hacked, which in this case is essentially what that was. Well, in this case, the website was hacked. That's a level even further abstracted from the actual operations of a plane. So in this case, let's be totally clear. What happened here, there's no risk of bringing down a plane by accessing, the website. However, if in terms of the bigger question of could you disrupt the operations of an airplane with hacking attacks, the answer is absolutely. I mean, every major country has, Air Force divisions, that do nothing but, signals jamming, injecting false information into radio frequency streams, for fighter jets and things like that. So, kind of airborne war, the business of airborne warfare. We're talking about consumer, passenger planes here, but the business of airborne warfare is actually a very well-developed one. Could you bring the plane down with a cyber attack? Probably not. In most cases, but could you disrupt the communications? Could you disrupt the operations of a plane or of any other large piece of, kind of industrial equipment with cyber attacks? The answer to that is yes. For a determined enough adversary, they could absolutely jam the communications mechanisms. They could mess with the IT systems that coordinate, communications between the plane and the ground and things like that. But it's not so simple as, okay, I'm going to hack the plane and bring it down. There are lots of mechanical systems that are in place that if you were trying to do that, it'd be a very, very sophisticated attack. But again, that's not what we're talking about here. And I think this is actually a really important it's a really important reminder when you see hacks like this and you see news of it. Always try to view these attacks through the lens that, I would encourage you to view it through the lens that I try to, which is, okay, are these IT systems or are these operational systems? 99% of the time, what you're going to see is they're IT systems. They're, transaction servers, they're financial servers, they're web servers, or things like that. In that case, usually pretty easy to remediate and diagnose. Operational stuff, a logic bomb found on, the computer systems aboard the airplane, totally different thing. And when we see those things, that's a much bigger deal. Well, with that, we are out of time. Thank you so much for the questions. Thank you for watching. If you have any questions for me, offline, I'm on Twitter. It's at JordanR1000, JORDAN, the letter R 1000. Our website is bloomberg.com/technology. We broadcast this show live every week at noon Eastern on Thursdays here from the Bloomberg News Bureau in Washington, D.C. I hope I've answered your questions adequately. If not, feel free to connect with me offline or on Twitter. And with that, I wanted to thank everybody who helps make this show come together, Pia Gadkari, Austin Weinstein, and everybody else who helps out. Thanks so much for watching. Look forward to seeing some of you next week on Digital Defense.